Oliver, I've had the pleasure of knowing for probably a good 15 years or so here in Sydney. However, Oliver grew up not in Australia, but in the UK and has spent considerable time in the US as well as in Asia and Australia. So has worked on at least 4 continents. Is that right? Or have you worked in more than four?
That'll be right.
Four
Yeah.
continents. Okay. And your background is in economics, is in finance, insurance, but more recently has been in coaching with an organization called Pharos. And it's particularly that expertise, not exclusively, but particularly that expertise that he's going to be bringing to us this morning. And Oliver's talk is entitled Know Thyself Before You Turn Your Resume. So, Oliver, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Peter. And good morning, everybody. And it's really a privilege and a pleasure to be invited to speak to you. I hope what I've got to say will be of some value. It's not a very long talk, but it sort of reaches a point that resonates with me particularly, and I hope it resonates with you as well. Just to give you a bit more background pertinent to this particular meeting, I have actually had two significant corporate transitions in my career. One was, I guess, around about 1987 to 1990 when I made a big decision to change. And in addition to those two corporate transitions, the second one took place around about 2003 or thereabouts. So it's quite some time ago. And in addition to those two significant corporate transitions, I had one major life transition. And more recently, I've made a number of changes in my career. And I wouldn't call these transitions, I'd call them sort of adjustments to my life as a small businessman. So the first two corporate transitions took place. The first was when I left my first employer, Chase Manhattan, after 17 years. This was a difficult decision for me because I really loved this bank. I joined them from university, graduate school, and I was blessed with some amazing assignments because at that time, there was generally a shortage of people who were willing to invest in an international career. So if you were willing to pack your bags and get going, and you had a head on your shoulders and you looked reasonably sane, there was quite a strong probability you'd get a good job. So, and I had some fantastic jobs with Chase, and I finished with them as the head of investment banking for Asia Pacific, based in Hong Kong. After that, I had 2 or 3 years of doing this and that. I'd been recruited away from Chase by a businessman who seemed to be very bona fides, and in fact had taken over a large corporation here in Australia, and he wanted me to be the CFO. But as often happens in transitions, what you expect to happen doesn't happen. And in the downturn of 1987, he lost control of this company. And so that job was out. And after a bit of consulting with him on other things, and I looked into his affairs and found out that he had some very, very serious issues to deal with. We parted company, and I spent a little while doing some consulting work based in Hong Kong. And then I joined MetLife, which was my second big employer. And that was really amazing how I came to get that job. Really, it was I think, it involved many decisions on my part, but it was a fantastic job, and it was a very good transition for me away from the banking industry into a slightly slower moving, nonetheless important industry, insurance. And I was with them for 14 years, and it was a very, very interesting time as well, different from the first time. So 2 fantastic jobs with an important transition in the middle. And over and above that, during the second career with MetLife, my wife of 27 years passed away. Diane passed away. So that was, she died of cancer in 1996. And so that was a very painful transition as well. And I bring that in because I feel that one has to accept that there are transitions in life, some of which have to do with your work, but sometimes and very frequently to do with your personal life. So I'm sympathetic to anyone who's in this sort of situation, which is becoming more and more frequent and normal in life today. So in navigating these three transitions, especially the third one, I was helped greatly by my belief in a personal God who cared about me. I bring that up and mention that because for those of you who are in this search, it can be a very lonely, very frustrating business. And having this belief, confidence, if you like, it gave me the feeling that I was not only at the mercy of the marketplace. And it helped me to be calmer and more collected and more prayerful as I pursued my goals. Having said this, I am very sympathetic to those very complicated feelings and challenges in all aspects of a job search, which have to be handled well to result in a successful outcome. I'm also sympathetic to the fact that times have now changed, and I was blessed to live in a period of time where the job market seemed to me to be a lot more orderly than it is today. So what I'd like to do now is to move on to the coaching environment. Why did I get into executive coaching? I mean, I asked myself that question. I've been in it for 14 years now. Initially, believe it or not, it was the need to get some cash flow going because I'd sustained a fairly large operating loss in a business that I was involved with. And I needed to get as many sources of cash flow going as possible. So this was one of the sources that I looked at and got into. But having got into it, I began to feel this was a great place to be, and I continue to feel that. I would caution those of you who are thinking possibly about a career in executive coaching that to be highly successful in a financial sense involves a degree of marketing and promotional skill that very few people have. So you have to be willing to accept, perhaps as I have, that this isn't going to make you rich, but it can make you very comfortable in terms of your job enjoyment, and it can introduce you to some very, very interesting people. And I've been fortunate in some of my clients, ranging from companies like VW, very, very unusual company, I have to tell you, universities, not-for-profits, small businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So, these are very, very interesting companies, and that's a sort of a nice byproduct of being in the coaching industry. So now what I'd like to do is to sort of, having given you a sort of general background of who I am, where I've come from, I'd like to sort of zero in on one small detail about coaching that I'd like to share with you, and it's one that fascinates me. And I hope that this particular idea is helpful to you as you go about your own revaluation, which is inevitable when you transition from one job to another. When I start a coaching engagement, I always try to establish as clearly as possible the context of the coaching assignment, and especially the dynamics of the client's own situation. If you don't do that, then you can start off on very shaky ground where you have made certain assumptions about this person, some informed, perhaps some ill-informed, and then you proceed. And if you don't have this right, you can lose the confidence of your client pretty quickly. When I start coaching, I always use a profiling tool, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. There are many of these on the market, but the one we choose to use is called Hogan's Personality Suite. And these profiles are very accurate, and they provide essentially a neutral reference point or reference data to establish as closely as possible the facts about the client and the client's personality. And these findings, which are very, as I said, very complex and very sophisticated, are very rarely refuted by the client for one very good reason, that the client has actually provided the data themselves for the profile through the questionnaire. So either the client has managed the questionnaire, for which there is absolutely no reason for them to do so, and if they have, the profile will actually establish that they've done this, or they will accept that this data is there, it's what they provided, and therefore there's some level of truth in it, usually a very significant amount of truth in it. This data is very comprehensive and explores all the relevant personality traits which are important for business. And it also provides, perhaps even more importantly, relativity, an understanding of the relative strength of the trait against others in your own personality and also in the population generally. So you get a quantitative measure, very exact measure. And I mention the profile because what I'm about to talk about is, if you like, the opposite of that. We're going to go to a very qualitative type of measurement, which is useful for the client to understand themselves better. Before I examine these constituent traits in the client's personality and open these up for discussion, I try to find some narrative truths about the individual's reputation in order to show that there's other data which supports the findings of the profile as well. What I want to know is what people think of my client. Now, we all know 360-degree surveys are very detailed, and I'm very happy to use these. The problem is that often they are not accepted by the client as being fair, although they too are very sophisticated and generally they are fair, but they suffer from this problem that this is a survey filled out by a whole range of people, many of whom the client suspects are hostile to them, and therefore the results are biased. So the 360 is, I think, a very useful analytical tool, and I'll always use it. But the client sometimes has problems in accepting it. So instead, with the agreement of the client, I usually start with three people: the individual's boss, a peer, and a subordinate. And all these, other than the boss, of course, are nominated by the client and chosen for their honesty and goodwill. I don't want them to tell me somebody who's going to give some sort of biased, nasty comment, snide comment or anything like that for political reasons or whatever. I want people who are sort of goodwill and open. And I ask these people three questions. And of course, based on their response, I can tell how genuine they are and what their motivation is. So these three questions I ask them under conditions of complete confidentiality are: number one, what are the human qualities you appreciate about my client? And second, what areas of his or her work did you find to be strong? And thirdly, what areas do you think would help my client to improve? What could they do to improve? And I then report my findings to the client, taking care to disguise the answers so the respondent cannot be easily identified. The first two questions are important because they build confidence in the client that their better traits are appreciated and also that their work product is appreciated. But as you can imagine, the third question always attracts the most attention because it deals with, if you like, the dark side, a side which perhaps the client is only slightly aware of. And it can be a shock for the client to understand that some improvements hitherto not mentioned to them are being called for by their bosses, their peers, and subordinates. And sometimes, rarely have they heard these before. And the validity of those comments are, as you could imagine, strengthened when there is consistency between these reports. Now, I find there are usually three categories for improvements. In the first category, we might see sort of operational issues such as timeliness, ability to handle detail well, and effective communication. In the second, we might see something a bit more personal, a need for the client to be more sociable, to be less demanding, to improve relations with the opposite sex. I've even heard remarks such as to moderate unattractive humor, to become more serious, to curb over drinking in social occasions and the like. But in the third category of these comments, we're looking at deeper issues, particularly those pressure situations in which the client responds in a way inconsistent with their day-to-day responses and disturbs a previous perception of who the client really is. I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about here, that something causes this person to wander off the subject, become overly obsessed with some insignificant detail, gets violently angry, etc., etc. Now, before we examine the data in the profiles, which will explain this usually, we therefore see a picture emerging which comes from colleagues in whom they trust. And this usually provokes a lively discussion, sometimes defensive in nature, sometimes accepting. Now, in this discussion, what I like to propose, if there has been some disjunction between what the clients say and between what the colleagues say and what the client seems to accept, I like to propose that there is perhaps a gap between the client's perception of him or herself and how others see them. And you might say, and I like to use these words, that there is a gap between the person's identity, how they see themselves, and their reputation, which is how other people see them. It's perhaps unsurprising that most of us believe our sense of who we are, how we see ourselves, is more important than how other people see us. There is, in a sense, a feeling of even moral indignation that people just don't get us. Yet, as we know, in a business environment, our reputation, how other people see us, is directly related to our ability to get things done. It's the source of our influence, our credibility, our trustworthiness, and our effectiveness. The coaching sessions that follow deal with many, many other things. But if nothing else is achieved, I like to believe that some progress is made towards closing the gap between identity and reputation. This will inevitably mean some adjustments must take place. I'm always concerned, however, that once a person's reputation is firmly in place, it may be difficult to change it. The client can work hard to make fundamental changes in attitude and behavior. Yet, the colleagues and the boss of the person making these changes sometimes remain unaware or unwilling to accept these changes have occurred or that such efforts are being made. This can be demoralizing and is perhaps only overcome by time and some honest and assertive discussions between the individual and his boss and his colleagues. In other situations, of course, colleagues do see some major change take place. And when that happens, it's really wonderful to see because my client's effectiveness is immediately enhanced. And it makes my job feel very rewarding. So that's what I had to say to you. In making these observations, I want to encourage you during these times of transition to spend time in a lively self-debate, or perhaps a debate that includes your spouse, about this issue, whether there's a difference between how you see yourself, your identity, and how others see you, your reputation. If you suspect that there is a gap, then try to get to the bottom of it. Make some changes. It may not result in you finding a job that you want, but it will go a long way towards making you a more attractive candidate, a more attractive colleague, and a person who is happier in their own skin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. That was wonderful. Great framework for us to be thinking and have a very fruitful discussion, I'm sure.